That's where you do all your work on yourself, right? And you can't continue to give to an organization if you don't take time to figure out and to work on yourself. And that can be, you know, watching videos or reading books or, taking classes or just seeing a therapist is always good. But really being able to figure out how you need to recharge and why you do what you do and why you're doing what you're doing. Because a lot of it comes from the way we were brought up.
Well, we're sitting down talking some nonprofit today. Got Jodee Ryan here on the team talking some nonprofit stuff. I know we've got some exciting topics that we can dive into, but something that you've been kind of kicking around a bunch lately has been succession planning for nonprofits. I don't know. In my opinion, succession planning seems pretty straightforward, pretty simple to understand from a regular traditional for-profit type business or even a small business, as an example. But I don't know. Can you like unpack a little bit? Like, what does succession planning like mean in the context of nonprofits?
So with succession planning with nonprofits, the key is there are so many people that need to have the information, right? So depending on if the leader leaves, then the board needs to have that piece of what they knew. A lot of times they keep it in their head. And sometimes if a board member leaves, you want to make sure that like of the next board, the evolution of your board is also important with the succession planning. So there's like lots of different pieces to it. And even a lot of times because it's a nonprofit and because they are totally living their passion, their mission, and they're focusing so much on the impact in the community that they sometimes don't take that time to work in the business as we talk about all the time. And most of that is just knowing day-to-day tasks, knowing what needs to be done every day and who's in charge of what, and just getting it written down. And a lot of times when you have a nonprofit leader leave, you will find that there's a lot of fumbling going on because of the fact that the executive director had been there for 30 years or they'd only been there 2 years. It kind of depends, but they have not really put down what they do and given that kind of that step-by-step plan of what needs to be done and how to keep the mission and the vision of the organization strong during the transition.
Okay, that makes sense. So you had kind of referenced two pieces there from obviously the leader, like the executive director, the CEO, whoever's kind of leading the organization from day-to-day operations. Then you've got the board side of things. And you had mentioned something there, like when a board member leaves and like knowing what that looks like to continue to keep the board built, having just a little bit of experience in nonprofit world and experiencing kind of that board side of things a little bit in my history. Is it like common that nonprofits don't, or is it common that they don't have, um, like it written down on what their I don't know term lengths are and how they how often they're putting people into the funnel for coming onto the board, things like that. Is that common, or is that usually kind of in place, and this would be beyond kind of that part of the planning?
Usually that's in place. Usually you know exactly how long somebody's terms are. They have it in the bylaws but the reality of it's a non-paying job and it's a volunteer position. So people move or they get busier with their kids or whatever. And so it shifts when they maybe go off the board and you don't have the backup. You don't have the, number of people like, oh, here's what we need to have on the board or what did they bring to the board, and now let's say it's an attorney and they brought some great legal advice, free advice, and so now you're losing that piece of it. So do you have another attorney in the wings, or is it somebody that has a really great connections for fundraising, and really looking at the matrix of the board but having that s- um, in writing of what you need and where you're going.
How just general like rule of thumb, how many like kind of I don't want to say backup. Backup's not the right word, but how many people should be kind of in the general queue for kind of any just normal nonprofit. I'm sure, depending on size, all that kind of stuff may make, some differences on the numbers. But like if you were to advise a nonprofit today and say, hey, you should at least have X number of kind of folks in the wings that said that they're interested and they're just in the queue in case something were to come up prior to a traditional, term ending for a board member.
Yeah, I would say, 3 to 5, having some kind of plan of even if you don't have a name necessarily, but you have just a, uh, a need in the organization, and they're just being like, it's always good to have an attorney or having somebody that's actually, used your services on the board and being that community voice and kinda having the key pieces of what your board looks like, and then having, like, those 5 areas kind of, like, at least in the back of your mind or written down, and then always have the board, um, have ideas in their heads too as well.
Hmm. In your experience, being having worked in so many different nonprofit organizations and grown them and built them and done a whole bunch of different stuff with them, um, what was your process in working with the board and working as a leader within the organization? Like, how frequently did you go back and look at who do we now know in our network that would be good to have some conversations with and be get involved at least at that level, even if it's not to a board yet? Is that something you looked at just like once a year? Was it more frequently than that? Was it less frequently than that? What was your experience?
I failed miserably many times, getting a board built. I have had, there's some where you come in and we're down to 4 board members, and so basically the organization needs completely rebuilt. But a lot of that's just having, I would always start with an alignment, right? And always have a board questionnaire whenever I started an organization, and I'd want to know more about my board. I will I wish I would have done disc profiles on my boards that I didn't listen to the wonderful coach of a husband that I have. And but really like getting to know what they are, why they're on the board, and having that piece so that I could understand where the board is, what their passions are and why they're on there. So then you can look at what's missing um and what where and where you can grow the organization together and keeping them all on the same page. um I think the other piece that you didn't even ask me, but I failed miserably, is the continuing with the mission vision moments, like at board meetings or having something on the agenda that keeps everybody in line of where we're going, right? And why they're there. And I'm part of a committee for a nonprofit right now, and I love it because every time we have a meeting, we get a mission story. Just they want to just make sure we're all back onto why we're there.
Ooh. So going to what is like a mission story sound like? Like I imagine it's more than just here's what the mission is and like recite what's on the wall. But mission story, like what does that look like in real life?
So for this nonprofit, it's they bring a story. So they talk about one of their somebody that they've impacted, one of their clients, and they talk about how they were helped, or like let's say it would be a food bank, right? And they have a family that came in and needed like food, or they needed this is what happened. Mom and dad got sick and they couldn't afford this and that. And they just tell the story of that person that used their services. And the outcomes are, even if you have not, usually you're looking for the positive outcomes, but even if it's a not positive outcome, it explains why you're there and what the purpose is and the mission.
Hmm. And who's usually bringing those stories, to the forefront? Is it particular individuals on either a committee or a board? Is it somebody's responsibility to come up with that stuff? Like, what's the best? How do you start to implement that if that's not
Mhm.
something that's currently being done?
Well, I think that one thing would be the executive director, depending on the size of your team, right? So if you're a small team, it may be the executive director leadership that's bringing it to the table. But I think that goes back to even your team meetings, right? Keeping everybody on the same page and understanding why we're there and having the team that's working with the nonprofits or with the community that's using the services, and it might be a volunteer, right? But it's getting that story and then having it brought to the team meeting, whether that's, you know, um, having that and looking at each like board member and say, okay, we know that it's going to be the executive director because they're the ones who are always at the board meetings. Or if it's a bigger board meeting and you have some of your like your program people that may come, have them go ahead and tell the story, but really making sure that it's on every agenda of every meeting, team wide, organization wide, just as that it doesn't have to be long. Just
I would imagine that having that type of thing consistent creates a much different feel. I've been kind of thinking about this the last, I don't know, few days on like why do I look forward to things in general? Whether it's, I look forward to, I don't know, going for a walk, or I look forward to doing this part of my job, or I look forward to X, Y, and Z. And I go, why do I feel, or why do I look forward to it? And I realize it's all a feeling. It's the experience, it's the feeling that I get. So I imagine
Mhm.
this kind of aligns directly with that. It's not just reciting what the mission is, it's actually feeling what the impact is, which can create, a deeper feeling within the board, the committee, the team, whoever, um, whoever's involved in this particular part of the organization. Would you like? Do you agree with that? Is kind of what's your thoughts
No,
on how
yeah.
that all kind of comes together, and how important it is to share kind of these stories of real world impact, and how that impacts the individuals who choose to be a part of the organization.
Oh, it's definitely impacts because there are some that are like, they're on the line, right? They're dealing with the individuals who are coming in needing help, if it's an abuse situation, whatever that looks like. And so you have part of the organization that sees that all the time. And so, but then you may have somebody in the finance area that they don't get to see the actual programs at work. And so then they understand the commitment of why they're there and why they're not working at some big corporation making bazillions of dollars. They're there because they are making a difference in our communities. And that's the same with the board, giving them that story also not only does it help them remember why they're there and they're volunteering their time, but it also gives them something to share with people that they talk to and people that they run into to get more people interested in either giving or volunteering back to that organization.
Hmm. All right, so I'm gonna bring us back to succession planning, since we kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and which I think is really important in understanding. But we talked, all right, so importance there, succession planning, board member wise, being able to always kind of backfill, rebuild the board, have it balanced out with what's needed on the board, not just people who are enthusiastic, but being able to, where is that legal advice coming from? Who has the influence in, fundraising capabilities and things like that? So team side, executive director, CEO, depending on the size of the nonprofit, I'm sure other higher up level leaders within kind of the nonprofit organization. What is what does succession planning look like for those roles?
And it's really interesting because it's so hard. There's some that are really good at having documentation of what they do. And usually if you're switching leaderships, you're also probably switching some personalities. You're trying to find a leader that's going to take you to the next level. So there's going to be some management style differences, but the key piece of it is just the day-to-day operations. And this goes down to time mastery and knowing where you spend your time and having it written down and making sure that the processes are clear for everyone in the organization. And I'm a visionary, right? I see the big picture and then it's like, "Oh, well, I don't I didn't write that crap down," And so it's it's really hard sometimes because um you're so big, you're so, looking at the big impact and your heart is so full and you're like, I guess I didn't tell you that, you know, look at the financials every day, or double check to make sure the donors' credit cards are going through, or whatever that looks like for that organization in that particular role. Um, and all of your team members as well. I've worked with me and only me, and it all is in my head. And then I've also worked with teams where it's nice to know that, you know, if Susie comes in the morning, she knows this is what we do. This is like, I get, oh, turn on the lights. I mean, this sounds silly, but she makes the coffee. If, just make sure all these things are done, or before a board meeting, we make the name tags, we set everything up. Just all of those things that are, if they're written down, it really just makes that next step and the next change possible, because it's changing so fast. And with the hiring and the economy, there's a lot of nonprofit leaders that are leaving to take jobs in corporations where they can make more money. And so it's just to be prepared, because nobody, no, or get hit by a bus, you know, there's always that. We always use that line too. It's like, if we got hit by a bus tomorrow, what
So
would happen with your job?
whose responsibility do you think it is, or who should take ownership? Maybe that's probably the more accurate way to kind of ask this question. Um, who in the organization should take ownership for ensuring that that stuff is documented and is happening within the organization? Is that something the board should be essentially dictating back to the executive director, saying like these things have to have to happen, or is it the director needs to know that this is important for the long-term success of the organization, so they need to take it upon themselves? What do you see as kind of, where do you see that the ownership of that falling primarily for most organizations out there?
Yeah, and that's where it could get tricky, because the executive, the board, if it's a governance board, you don't want them micromanaging. But at the same time, I think that the executive committee, making sure that things are written down, and hopefully they've chosen a leader that understands that and wants that for her own or his own team as well. So, but I think ultimately part of the executive board really should make sure it's getting done,
Hmm.
but not in a way that they're dictating work. Yeah, it's like, it's that goes back to the personalities.
Communication becomes really important then.
Yes.
So I want to like dive into this a little bit on like your experience, because you made the comment like visionary. I would imagine, I'm just assuming here, but I would imagine that many folks that choose to take on this level of a role within a nonprofit are tend to be more of the visionary side of things, less kind of tactical, operational, more visionary. I see the big picture of where this organization can go and the impact that it can have. It's my guess, my assumption. But if that's the case, like you just went through a process where you had to have your systems and processes and everything that was in your head written down. Like you merged two organizations together and like basically moved yourself out of a job that was a succession, right? So how did you shift? Like what did you have to do to move from, oh crap, I need to do this because I'm so focused on big visionary big picture stuff, to we're going to go through this process of merging. Now this is a like non-negotiable. What had to shift for you? Like tell us a little bit about the story of what it was like for you personally to go through that.
I would have to say that acknowledging my um limitations, and being okay with that, and then not feeling threatened, and you got to let your ego go, and not feeling threatened when you have the right people on the board, or the right people on your team that help with the details and all of that. And so if they're coming to you and saying, I need it in writing, let's get a spreadsheet together. it's it's to be able to really appreciate those challenges, or those different personalities, right? And so that goes back to knowing what's on your team, knowing the personalities, knowing who's good at what, and making sure that you aren't hiring all of the same me's, right? I don't want everybody to be a visionary or nothing's going to get done. And so I I have suffered and cried in front of my board and gotten mad in front of my boards before, just with the frustration because I didn't want to do the detail stuff.
I imagine it can take an emotional toll having to go through that.
Oh yeah, you
Um,
know what? Definitely, especially when you're emotional.
what have been some of your um, what have been some ways that you've found that have been really powerful for you to overcome some of those emotional challenges? And I think this is, relation to not just nonprofits, but anyone that's in a higher level position, having to deal with real people and where things are going and things like that. There's a lot of emotional pressure that comes along with it. Like what are some of the things that you found have worked for you to be able to overcome when it becomes really emotional and challenging and frustrating and it's just almost too much in the moment?
Yeah, I think finding your peace, right? Finding what you need to re-energize yourself, what you need to make yourself say, okay, I need to breathe before I speak. And I am terrible at that. But I'm getting better, kind of. No, I'm not. And but to really um that's where you do all your work on yourself, right? And you can't continue to give to an organization if you don't take time to figure out and to work on yourself. And that can be, you know, watching videos or reading books or, taking classes or just seeing a therapist is always good. But really being able to figure out how you need to recharge and why you do what you do and why you're doing what you're doing. Because I mean, a lot of it comes from the way we were brought up. It's like you think you have to be busy because when you're busy, you're valued. Um, I'm just in the process of reading a book by Mel Robbins, and she talks about that all the time. And it's just like, oh yeah, I probably, I don't even want to think of what I did to my kids.
Ah, yeah, the self-care piece I think is really important, and I want to tie this back into kind of the succession planning and the importance of it, and knowing, the transition from leader to leader, and having the systems documented so that, the board or the next leader can kind of just pick up and be able to continue on, the mission of the organization. Um, so I want to talk about your transitions. Um, Most people watching this probably have zero idea. So I'm going to share just, one fun little tidbit. You work for an organization called Main Street Mason City, downtown organization, and your successor was actually me. So I got the other side of it, and I'm the detailed guy that does look at processes and everything else like that. And you're the visionary. And while there was a lot of things documented, there was still a gap between leader to leader, right? And I got to see that firsthand. Um, and my tenure was very short at the organization, so I have really not a whole lot to talk about on the topic. However, it gives some context because I know that you've had several instances where leaving an organization, you've had conversations with the the leadership that took over after you, and have continued on conversations with them. So I kind of want to look at this in really kind of two regards. One, is that something that should be there? As a outgoing executive director, should you know that there may be, a few months to however long of kind of some, go ahead, pick up the phone, just call me. I'll help with the transition as much as possible. And then how do you balance that with eventually it, too much is too much? And at what point do you just say, I can't be a part of this organization anymore. I have to focus on this next thing, and tying in some of that self care.
Yeah.
Unpack that a little bit. I think there, I mean, that's a very
That's an
large
international
topic,
trip.
but let's talk a little bit about that, because I think from a succession planning standpoint, you probably see this more in nonprofits than you do in for-profit entities, where if there's a transition, things like that, and I could be dead wrong, but um, I would imagine because of the mission, because of the reasons people get into nonprofits, there may be more of this overlap in transition from one leadership to the next leadership.
Yes, there is. And I, it goes back to, for me, I was usually brought into the nonprofit to fix, to bring new life, to bring new vision. And so um, I didn't want any baggage, right? I mean, other than like processes and the basics, but I didn't need anybody to come in and say, you need to do this, 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 and this, because that was, here's the mission, here's what we do. And but at the same time, it was good to for me to, when I left, depending on the situation, again, it's if it's somebody's leaving because they choose to leave or somebody's leaving because they didn't choose to leave, um, having the ability to have the basic stuff written down. And that's where I think it's so important that the board does, because you never know if that leader is going to leave and be willing to help or not. So having the basics down, um, and then being open to, if they are leaving, and being open to say, yes, I'm here if you have any questions. When I would leave an organization, I am more apt to be open because I've left it, because I'm moving on to my next thing, my next, organization to help transition. And so I'm still supportive of, and I've a lot of times I've worked to mentor whoever's taking over that role, or at least give some advice. Um, you, my board, chair at the time, had met you and said, I want Boy Wonder to replace you, which was really weird. But I was glad because then I knew I could leave without writing all the processes it up and telling you, and knowing that you would document it and turn it into like a big old manual. So, knowing what that next step is or who's going to be coming in is always fun for me. But I also know when I come into an organization, I, um, depending on the situation or depending on what the board's vision is for that next person, um, I want to be able to be clear headed of like, I don't want any team member, noise. I just want to take everybody at face value and take everything at face value, and just build on that. So I don't know if I answered that, but it does. It depends. And I, unfortunately, I think you see a lot of, you probably see more nonprofits, people either retiring after being there for a really long time. And so it's obviously time for a fresh start, or you have people leaving maybe not by choice or not in the best of, because they're going to go do something else and they don't really want to help.
Mm,
They don't have the energy or the bandwidth to take over a new nonprofit, which they're usually going to that, and dealing with the old baggage.
mm. So, to kind of wrap the succession planning conversation up for at least today, I know there's tons more we can dive into over the next few weeks, and things like that. And we'll continue to have these conversations for the nonprofits out there so that they can continue to take some things to start implementing and grow and all of that kind of stuff. Um, from the succession planning topics or pieces that we've talked about so far today, if you had to boil it down to like one thing that a nonprofit, either nonprofit board members or the executive director, can kind of take and start implementing today that will help them on the path of succession planning, what would you say that one thing is?
Write it down. I think getting very clear on what needs to be in place if something does happen to the leadership. So looking at it as, okay, let's pretend Jody's gone. What do we need to know? And actually having these a brainstorming and discussion and looking at the organization and what it does every day and getting that stuff written down. The just the bare basic skeleton outline of what does this person do every day. And it's a lot of work.
As someone that has to document systems and processes, yes, it is a tremendous amount of work, but it's always a, yeah, it's do the work once, get paid long term or forever. It's kind of like that. Once you get it written down, then you always have it and you can just make iterations and changes to it. Um, and the beauty of writing down systems and things like that, not to make even more work for everybody that's listening, but as an organization grows and evolves, the systems and processes that were written down previously, even if it was only a year ago, 2 years ago, probably don't work anymore. They need to be updated. So it's kind of a never-ending process. So once you just kind of get in the rhythm of it and ensure that it's being done consistently, it does allow for greater impact because you have a lot more longevity in the organization overall.
Yep.
So,
And there's, if depending on your organization, if you're part of a larger organization, like United Way is part of a larger organization, and you can talk to other organizations, other United Ways, other Ys, whatever that looks like, and maybe get a skeleton that you can just and then make it local.
mm,
So I do not believe in inventing wheels over and over again.
yeah, leverage where possible.
Yes.
Um, well, cool. I think that kind of wraps up the conversation today. We'll be back with more nonprofit conversations here over the next few weeks, diving into succession planning deeper, into, I don't know, business planning, into what does marketing and sales look like for a nonprofit specifically. A whole bunch of different stuff that we'll be diving into over the next few weeks. May even open it up over time to get some input from the audience on different things that you'd like to know about from a nonprofit and kind of business building perspective. So be on the lookout for some of that, and we'll be coming out with a lot more fun conversations here in the future.
Blast.